The man's shadow fell long and sharp across the dusty floor of the courthouse, a stark line drawn between him and the figure behind the polished oak desk. Judge Hemlock smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of the lips. "She is a vagrant, Cole, a piece of unclaimed property. The law is clear." Cole's hands, raw and calloused from a lifetime of work, curled into fists at his sides. His voice was low, a rumble of stone on stone. "She ain't property, and she ain't unclaimed." The judge's eyes, cold as a winter river, narrowed. "She is my problem to solve." Cole took a step forward. "No, she's my promise to keep." If you believe a promise can change the world, that one good man can stand against the darkness, then stick around and see how a broken rancher found his soul in the most unexpected place. Let's go back to the beginning. The heat pressed down on the valley like a physical weight, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the very life from the soil. For Cole Marshall, the oppressive sun was just an echo of the emptiness that had scorched his world from the inside out. It had been 2 years since Mary was taken by the fever. 2 years since the silence in his sprawling ranch house had become a living, breathing thing. He moved through his days like a ghost, his heart a hollowed-out cavern where memories echoed and died. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, but the work, once a source of pride, was now just a series of motions to pass the time until he could fall into a dreamless sleep. He was a man made of dust and duty, his soul as parched as the land he worked. The ranch was his kingdom and his prison, a vast expanse of rolling hills and dry creek beds that mirrored the lonely plains of his own spirit. He had built it with Mary, their hands and hopes intertwined in every post and rail. Now her absence was a phantom limb, an ache that sharpened with every sunrise. He spoke to no one but his horse and the old mercantile owner in town, his words clipped and necessary. He had forgotten the shape of a real conversation, the easy give and take of shared thoughts. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his property line, and he reckoned that was just fine. A man alone couldn't be hurt again. He was a protector with nothing left to protect, a king in an empty castle. The fire that had once burned in his eyes was now banked to a low gray ember, and he saw no reason for it to ever burn bright again. He was rich in land but bankrupt in spirit, a man waiting for an end that refused to come. Cole rode into the town of Redemption with the sun at its zenith, the dust from the main street clinging to his clothes like a shroud. The town was a blister on the face of the prairie, a place of hard men and harder bargains. He usually avoided it, preferring the clean solitude of his land, but his supplies were low and the pantry was bare. He tied his horse outside the general store, the leather of the reins hot and slick in his hand. As he turned, a sound from the saloon next door cut through the thick, shimmering air. Not the usual raucous laughter or the tinny plink of the piano, but a low, guttural sob of pure despair. It was a sound so broken it snagged something deep inside him, a chord of forgotten grief that vibrated with a painful familiarity. Curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, warred with his instinct to keep walking. He told himself to ignore it. It wasn't his business. Nothing was his business anymore. But the sound came again, followed by a man's cruel laughter. "Get her out of here! She's bad for business!" Something in Cole snapped. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim, smoke-filled interior. The stench of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies hit him like a fist. And then he saw her. She was huddled in a corner, a small, fragile figure lost in the shadows. She wore a white prairie dress, once fine, now tattered and stained with grime, its color a stark accusation against the filth of the room. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was unbound and fell around her face, hiding her features. but it was her hands he saw first, clenched together so tightly the knuckles were white, trembling with a force that seemed to shake her entire body. A heavy-set man, the saloon owner, was standing over her, his face a mask of cruel impatience. "I said get out!" he snarled, making a move to grab her. Cole crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence sucking the air from the space. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his large, steady hand on the saloon owner's shoulder. The man froze, turning to see who dared to interrupt him. He saw Cole's face, hard as granite, and the cold fire that had suddenly returned to his eyes. The owner swallowed, his bravado evaporating. "She was just left here, Cole. Some railroad man said she was part of a deal that went sour. Said she was baggage." Cole's gaze shifted to the woman on the floor. Her shoulders were shaking, and a single whispered phrase escaped her lips, a sound of utter desolation. "Nobody wants me." The words struck Cole with the force of a physical blow. He knelt, ignoring the sticky floor, moving with a gentleness that surprised even himself. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched, curling in on herself. He didn't try to touch her. He just waited. Slowly she lifted her head, and he saw her face for the first time. She was Chinese, her features delicate, her eyes enormous and haunted, swimming with unshed tears. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the very worst of the world. In that moment, the hollow cavern in his chest filled with a feeling he couldn't name. It was fierce and protective and utterly absolute. He looked from her terrified face to the leering patrons of the saloon. He stood up, his full height casting a protective shadow over her. "I reckon that ain't true," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I do." He held out his hand, palm up. "My name is Cole Marshall. You're coming with me." The ride back to the ranch was a silent ordeal, a study in tension and fragility. He had lifted her onto his horse, her body so light it felt like she was made of nothing but air and sorrow. She sat stiffly in front of him, her back ramrod straight, refusing to lean against the solid wall of his chest. Her hands gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles bone white, as if she feared he might cast her off at any moment. Cole kept a steady pace, his every sense attuned to the trembling woman before him. The sun beat down, but he felt a different kind of heat radiating from her, the fever of fear. He could feel the fine tremors that ran through her body, could hear the shallow, hitched rhythm of her breathing. He said nothing, knowing that words were useless things against a terror so profound. Silence was the only language they shared. When they arrived at the ranch house, he slid from the saddle and reached up for her. She flinched violently, her eyes wide with panic, a small, wounded sound escaping her throat. He immediately dropped his hands. "Easy," he murmured, his voice softer than he'd intended. "I ain't going to hurt you. You can get down on your own." She hesitated, her haunted eyes searching his face for the lie, the trap. Finding none, she slowly, awkwardly, slid to the ground, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. Her feet were bare, caked in dirt and bleeding from small cuts. The sight sent a fresh wave of quiet fury through him. Who would do this? Who would treat another human being like discarded trash? He led her into the house, the cool, dim interior a stark contrast to the glaring heat outside. The house was clean but sterile, a place that was lived in, but not a home. It was Mary's house, and since she'd gone, it had felt like a museum to a life that was over. Now, this stranger's presence changed the very quality of the air. He gestured towards a simple wooden chair at the kitchen table. "Sit, I'll get you some water." She obeyed, perching on the very edge of the seat as if ready to flee. He worked with an economy of motion, fetching water from the pump, finding a clean cloth, and kneeling before her. He didn't ask permission. He simply took one of her small, wounded feet into his large hand and began to gently clean the cuts. Her entire body went rigid. A tear slipped from her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She watched his hands, his head bowed in concentration as he carefully, methodically, tended to her wounds. He knocked softly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating silence. "I'm not coming in," he said through the door, his voice steady and calm. "You're safe here, I promise. Whatever you're dreaming of, it can't get you here. I won't let it." He waited, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the door until he heard the quiet rustle of the bed sheets. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But in the deep, quiet darkness of the ranch, he had made a vow. He would be her shield. They fell into a strange, silent routine. He would rise before dawn, make coffee, and leave a plate of food on the kitchen table before heading out to work the ranch. She would emerge only after she heard the sound of his horse fading into the distance. He would return at dusk to find the plate empty and washed, placed precisely back where he had left it. She would be gone, hidden away in Mary's room. He caught glimpses of her sometimes, a fleeting shadow in the window, the whisper of movement from the hallway. She was like a wild creature, slowly learning the boundaries of a new, uncertain territory. He learned her name one evening, a week after her arrival. He found a small, intricately folded piece of paper on the table next to his dinner plate. On it, in hesitant, elegant script, was a single word: May. It was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of her silence. He began leaving things for her: a bowl of wildflowers he found by the creek, a new bar of scented soap from his trip into town, a soft wool blanket for the cool nights. He never presented them to her directly, simply left them where she would find them. Each small offering was a question. "Can you trust me?" Her answers were subtle. One day, the wildflowers appeared in a glass jar on the windowsill. Another day, the scent of the soap lingered faintly in the air after she had retreated to her room. One afternoon, he came home early, the heat having driven him back to the shade of the porch. He found her in the small garden Mary had planted, a place he hadn't been able to bring himself to tend. May was on her knees, her slender fingers gently pulling weeds from around a struggling rose bush. Her face, turned towards the sun, was a study in fierce concentration. She didn't see him. For the first time, he saw her not as a victim, but as a person. There was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a resilience in the careful way she nurtured the dying plant. The peace of the moment was shattered by the sound of an approaching rider. A cold knot formed in Cole's stomach. He knew that deliberate, arrogant pace. He stepped off the porch just as Judge Hemlock reined in his pristine black stallion, the animal's coat gleaming in the sun. Hemlock was the most powerful man in the county, a man who owned the bank, the law, and the souls of most of the townsfolk. His eyes, small and shrewd, immediately found May in the garden. She froze, her face draining of all color, and scrambled back towards the safety of the house. Hemlock's lips curled into a sneer. "Marshal," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I heard you'd picked up some stray baggage from the saloon. I've come to relieve you of the burden." Cole moved to stand between the judge and the house, his body a solid, immovable wall. "She ain't a burden, and she ain't leaving." Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Don't be a fool. The railroad man who brought her here, Mr. Vance, he left her as collateral for a debt he owed me. She belongs to me until he pays. She is, for all intents and purposes, My property. Pure, white-hot rage, an emotion Cole thought had died with his wife, surged through him. People ain't property, Judge. This one is, Hemlock said, his voice turning hard. She's an indentured woman from a foreign land with no papers and no rights here. She is a complication I intend to resolve. Give her to me, and you and I will have no trouble. Cole looked past the judge to the doorway where May was watching, her eyes wide with the familiar terror he was coming to despise. He looked back at Hemlock, his own eyes narrowing to slits. You ain't taking her, he said, his voice low and final. You'll have to come through me. And I promise you, Judge, you don't want to do that. The threat hung in the hot, still air. Hemlock's face darkened. You are making a powerful enemy, rancher. This town has rules. You'd do well to remember that. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and menace in his wake. Cole stood his ground until the judge was a speck on the horizon. He turned and saw May still frozen in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not just fear, but a tiny, flickering spark of something else. Hope. The judge's visit shattered the fragile peace of the ranch. The silence that had once been a source of comfort now felt heavy with unspoken threats. Cole saw the fear return to May's eyes, the way she started at every sound, the way she checked the windows, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon. The sanctuary he had tried to build felt fragile, its walls as thin as paper. He knew he couldn't fight Hemlock alone. The judge owned the sheriff and the law in Redemption. He needed an ally, someone the judge couldn't easily intimidate or buy. There was only one person he could think of, Dr. Althea Finch. Dr. Finch was as much an outsider as May, in her own way. A woman doctor from the East, she was tolerated for her skill but kept at arm's length by the town's conservative society. She was sharp, fearless, and had a deep-seated distrust of men like Judge Hemlock. The next morning, Cole explained his plan to May using simple words and gestures, his voice gentle but firm. We need help. A doctor. A friend. She can be trusted. May's eyes filled with uncertainty, but she looked at the resolve in his face and gave a small, hesitant nod. The journey to Dr. Finch's office on the edge of town was fraught with tension. Cole felt the stares of the townsfolk, saw them whispering behind their hands. He kept May close to his side, his hand resting near the small of her back without quite touching, a silent promise of protection. Dr. Finch's office was an oasis of clean, quiet order. The doctor herself was a tall, stern-looking woman with kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced confidence. She listened to Cole's story without interruption, her gaze occasionally shifting to May, who sat huddled in her chair, her eyes fixed on the floor. When Cole finished, Althea leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "You've kicked a hornet's nest, Cole," she said softly. "Judge Hemlock doesn't just run this town. He bleeds it dry. What he told you about Mr. Vance and the railroad is likely a lie, or at best, a twisted version of the truth." She rose and walked over to May, kneeling so she could look her in the eye. "My dear," she said, her voice gentle, "I need to ask you some questions. I need to know what happened to you, but only if you feel able to tell me." May looked from the doctor's compassionate face to Cole's steady one. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began to speak. Her voice was a mere whisper at first, her English broken but clear. She spoke of a village in a faraway land, of a promise of a new life in America as the wife of a merchant. She spoke of a long, brutal journey across the ocean. The merchant, her husband, had died of sickness on the ship. When she arrived, she was alone, with no money and no one to turn to. A man, Mr. Vance, had promised to help her. Instead, he had brought her here, to Redemption, and handed her over to Judge Hemlock as payment for a gambling debt. She was not indentured. She was a widow who had been trafficked like an animal. As she spoke, the doctor examined the faint, silvery scars on her wrists and the deep, soul weariness in her eyes. When May finished her story, a single tear rolled down her cheek. "He said I was worth nothing," she whispered. "That nobody wants a woman like me." Doctor. Finch placed a comforting hand on her arm. "That man is a monster, and he is wrong." She turned back to Cole, her eyes blazing with a righteous anger that mirrored his own. "This is worse than I thought. Hemlock doesn't have a legal claim. He has a bill of sale for a human being. He's a slaver, plain and simple. But he controls the courthouse. A judge's word is law here, even when the judge is the criminal. Proving it will be nearly impossible." Cole's jaw tightened. "Impossible ain't a word I care for, Doc. What do we do?" "We need evidence," Althea said, her mind already working. "A ledger, a contract, a witness. Someone who knows about Hemlock's dealings with the railroad. Someone brave enough to speak." She looked at Cole. "And you, Cole Marshall, need to understand the risk. He will try to ruin you. He will come after your land, your reputation, everything you have." Cole's gaze drifted to May, who was watching him with an expression of profound vulnerability. He thought of his empty house, his empty life. He had nothing left to lose, and for the first time in years, he had something precious to protect. "Let him try," Cole said, his voice a quiet vow. "I ain't backing down." They returned to the ranch under a sky bruised with the colors of sunset. The conversation with Dr. Finch had solidified the danger, but it had also forged a new kind of bond between them. The threat was no longer a shadowy monster. It had a name and a face, and they had an ally. That evening, for the first time, May did not retreat to her room when Cole returned. She was standing at the stove, stirring a pot that sent a warm, savory aroma through the kitchen. It was a simple stew of vegetables from the garden and a little smoked meat, but to Cole it smelled like hope. He stopped in the doorway, unsure of the new dynamic, unwilling to break the spell. She turned, a wooden spoon in her hand, and gave him a shy, tentative smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows from her haunted eyes. "I made dinner," she said softly. "You work hard. You should eat." He sat at the table, feeling clumsy and out of place in his own home. She served him a bowl of the stew, then sat opposite him with her own small portion. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against earthenware. The food was simple, but it was the best meal he had eaten in 2 years. It tasted of care, of gratitude. It tasted like a home. After dinner, he built a small fire in the hearth, more for the comfort of the light than for warmth. The summer nights were balmy, but the flickering flames cast a warm, protective glow over the room. May sat in a rocking chair that had been Mary's, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flames dance. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room, "for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. "No one should be treated the way you were." "In my country," she began, her voice hesitant, "a woman without a husband, without a family, she is like a ghost. She has no place. When my husband died, I became a ghost. Mr. Vance, the judge, they looked at me and they did not see a person. They saw a thing to be used." She paused, her fingers tracing the pattern on the arm of the chair. You look at me, and you see a person." The simple, profound truth of her words settled in the space between them. He had done nothing more than treat her with basic human decency, yet to her it was a miracle. He finally turned to look at her, truly look at her, bathed in the soft firelight. He saw the strength that lay beneath her fragility, the quiet intelligence in her dark, watchful eyes. He saw a survivor. "My wife, Mary," he said, the words feeling strange and rusty on his tongue. She made this place a home. When she died, the light went out. It's been dark for a long time." He looked around the room, at the jar of wildflowers on the mantel, at the clean, tidy space, at the woman sitting in the firelight. "It doesn't feel so dark anymore." A profound sense of peace settled over him, but it was tinged with a sharp, piercing fear. This feeling, this fragile warmth, this shared silence, was what was at stake. Judge Hemlock wasn't just threatening to take May away. He was threatening to plunge Cole's world back into the cold, silent darkness, and he would tear the world apart with his bare hands before he let that happen. The next week was a tense, quiet lull before the storm. Cole and Dr. Finch knew Hemlock would make his move, but they didn't know when or how. Althea began discreetly asking questions around town, probing for any weakness in the judge's armor, searching for anyone who might have a grievance against him. She found a wall of fear. People were too afraid of Hemlock's power to speak against him. Meanwhile, at the ranch, life continued. The domestic rhythm they had found deepened into something more. May began to take over the household chores, not as a servant, but as a partner. She mended Cole's shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. She tended the garden with a loving hand, coaxing the roses back to life. She learned to cook his favorite meals, her quiet presence transforming the sterile house into a warm, welcoming home. One afternoon, Cole found her humming a soft, sad melody as she kneaded bread, her hands covered in flour. The tune was foreign and ancient, full of a longing that made his heart ache. He realized he was no longer just protecting a stranger. He was protecting May. He was protecting her gentle spirit, her quiet strength, her sad, beautiful songs. He was falling in love with her. The thought terrified him. It felt like a betrayal of Mary, a ghost he still fiercely loved. But the feeling was undeniable. A green shoot pushing its way through the barren soil of his grief. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday morning. The sheriff, a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose loyalties were bought and paid for by Hemlock, rode up to the ranch. He didn't dismount, simply sat on his horse, a safe distance from the porch where Cole stood. He held out a piece of paper. "Official notice from Judge Hemlock, Cole," the sheriff said, avoiding his eyes. "There's to be a hearing on Friday to determine the legal guardianship and status of the woman." The word hung in the air, ugly and insulting. "Guardianship?" Cole repeated, his voice dangerously low. "She ain't a child." "It's a vagrancy and property claim, Cole. The judge is petitioning the court to have her declared an indentured asset of his estate. It's all legal-like." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You're ordered to bring her to the courthouse at 10 o'clock. If you don't, he'll issue a warrant." Cole took the paper, his hand trembling with rage. He watched the sheriff ride away, a coward fleeing the scene of his own dirty work. He turned to see May standing in the doorway behind him, her face pale. She had heard everything. Her eyes were wide with a familiar terror. The progress of the last few weeks wiped away in an instant. "He will take me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The law is on his side." Cole strode to her, his heart breaking at the sight of her despair. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but gentle, forcing her to look at him. "No," he said, his voice a raw, powerful promise. "Listen to me, May. He will not take you. I will not let him take you. Do you hear me?" He searched her eyes, willing her to believe him. "I gave you my word that you were safe here. That promise still stands. It will always stand." But inside, a cold dread was spreading through him. Althea had found no witnesses. They had no evidence. It would be his word, a lonely rancher's word, against the absolute power of Judge Hemlock in his own courtroom. It was a fight he didn't know how he could possibly win. But as he looked into May's terrified eyes, he knew he would die trying. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, the sky a dull, oppressive lid on the world. The mood in the small ranch house was just as somber. May had put on the best dress she had, a simple blue calico that Cole had bought for her, but it couldn't hide the terrified pallor of her skin or the dark circles under her eyes. Cole stood before the small mirror in his room, adjusting the collar of his one good shirt. He looked at the reflection of the man staring back at him, a stranger with grim, determined eyes and lines of worry etched around his mouth. He was no lawyer. He was a man of the land, his hands more comfortable with reins and tools than with words and arguments. But today, his words were the only weapon he had. They rode into town in silence, the air thick with impending doom. The courthouse was already full. It seemed the entire town of Redemption had turned out for the spectacle. Cole saw faces in the crowd, some curious, some hostile, a few sympathetic, but cowed into silence. He helped May down from the horse, holding her hand for a brief moment. It was cold as ice. "Stay close," he murmured. "I'm right here." Inside, the courtroom was a stuffy, intimidating space that smelled of old paper and fear. Judge Hemlock was already seated behind his high bench, looking down on them like a king from his throne. His face was a mask of smug satisfaction. He held all the cards. The hearing began. Hemlock, acting as both judge and plaintiff, laid out his case with cold, legal precision. He presented a document, a bill of sale signed by a Mr. Vance, attesting that the unnamed Chinese woman had been transferred to him to settle a debt. He spoke of vagrancy laws, of the town's need for order, of the burden of unattached individuals. He never once looked at May, referring to her as the asset or the property. Cole felt a murderous rage building in his chest, a pressure so intense he thought he might explode. I find in my own favor. The woman will be remanded to my custody. A gasp went through the courtroom. It was over. Cole had failed. He looked at May and saw utter despair on her face. She was closing her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Hemlock banged his gavel. "This hearing is—" "Wait!" The voice was thin and reedy, but it cut through the tense silence like a knife. Everyone turned. Standing near the back of the courtroom, trembling from head to foot, was Mr. Abernathy, the meek little town clerk. He was clutching a heavy ledger book to his chest as if it were a shield. "I have something to say," Abernathy squeaked, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. Hemlock's face contorted with fury. "Mr. Abernathy, you are out of order. Sit down at once." But the clerk, emboldened by some newfound courage, took a shuffling step forward. "No," he said, his voice gaining a surprising strength. "I will not sit down. I have been your clerk for 15 years, Your Honor. I have watched you twist the law to your own purposes. I have recorded fraudulent land deeds and falsified debt records. I stayed silent because I was a coward." He held up the ledger. "This is your private ledger, the one you keep hidden in the courthouse safe. I know because I am the one who hides it for you. It details all your dealings, including your arrangement with Mr. Vance." He opened the book, his finger shaking as he pointed to a page. "It says right here, Mr. Vance didn't owe you a debt. You paid him. You paid him $200 for the acquisition of Chinese labor. You didn't buy a debt, Judge. You bought a person." The courtroom erupted. The revelation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Mr. Abernathy's words, backed by the open ledger in his hands, were an undeniable accusation. Judge Hemlock's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, crumbled into a canvas of pure, unadulterated fury and panic. "Lies!" he roared, his voice cracking. "That man is a liar! The book is a forgery! Sheriff, arrest this man for perjury!" But the sheriff, for once, didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes wide, looking from the damning ledger to the enraged faces of the townsfolk. The people of Redemption had long suspected the judge's corruption, had whispered about it in hushed tones, but they had never had proof. Now the proof was laid bare for all to see. Mr. Abernathy, the town's most timid man, had become its bravest. Doctor Althea Finch, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward. "I am a medical doctor, Your Honor," she announced, her voice clear and strong, "and I have examined May. She bears the marks of abuse and malnutrition consistent with being trafficked against her will. Mr. Abernathy's evidence corroborates my medical findings. This is not a property dispute. This is a criminal matter." The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing from a low hum to an angry buzz. They were looking at Hemlock not with fear, but with contempt. His power, built on a foundation of intimidation and deceit, was dissolving before his very eyes. Cole stood beside May, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through her own. He squeezed gently, a silent message of support. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears, but for the first time they were tears of relief, not terror. The tide had turned. A federal marshal who had been in town on other business and had sat quietly observing the proceedings from the back row now stood up. His face was grim, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Judge Hemlock," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a higher authority, "I believe your time on that bench is over. You'll come with me. There are some federal statutes regarding slavery and human trafficking I'd like to discuss with you." Hemlock stared, his mouth agape. He had been untouchable for so long, he couldn't comprehend his own downfall. As the marshal led him away, stripped of his power and his dignity, the courtroom broke into a cacophony of shouts and applause. In the midst of the chaos, Cole and May stood in a small, quiet bubble. The world outside them was loud and triumphant, but for them, there was only the profound silence of victory. He turned to her, his heart full to bursting. He saw his future in her eyes. Right there in the middle of the noisy, crowded courthouse, he knew what he had to do. "May," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is your home now, if you want it to be. The ranch is your home." She nodded, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "It is already my home." "Then there's only one thing left to do to make it official," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He took both of her hands in his. "May, will you marry me?" She looked at him, her heart in her eyes, her answer shining brighter than any words. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Cole, I will." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, the long, lonely winter of his soul finally, irrevocably over. He had found his purpose. He had kept his promise. and he had found love in the last place he ever expected. The epilogue of their lives was not written in court records or history books, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of the seasons on the Marshall Ranch. They were married by a traveling preacher a week after the hearing, a simple ceremony under the vast, open sky, with Dr. Finch and a newly confident Mr. Abernathy as their witnesses. May wore a new dress, the color of a summer sky, and in her hair she wore a single, perfect white rose from the garden she had brought back to life. Her smile was the brightest thing in the valley. Their life together was a testament to the healing power of quiet love. The ranch, once a monument to Cole's grief, became a vibrant, living place. Laughter echoed in the halls that had long been silent. The aroma of May's cooking filled the air, a constant, comforting presence. She planted more than just flowers. She planted roots, turning the house into a home, a true sanctuary. Cole, the broken protector, found his purpose not just in shielding her from the world, but in sharing it with her. He taught her to ride, her initial fear giving way to a joyful freedom as she galloped beside him across the open plains. She taught him patience, showed him the beauty in small things, the intricate pattern of a spider's web at dawn, the taste of wild berries, the comfort of holding hands by the fire on a cold winter's night. The darkness never fully left her eyes. Some traumas cast shadows that last a lifetime, but it retreated, replaced by a deep, abiding light. The nightmares still came sometimes, but now, when she woke with a cry, Cole was there to hold her, his steady presence a constant reminder that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was wanted. Years turned into decades. The town of Redemption, freed from Hemlock's grip, slowly became a better place. Cole and May were respected, their story a local legend, a quiet reminder of the power of courage and conviction. They watched the world change, the railroad bringing new faces and new ideas, but their world remained centered on the ranch and on each other. They grew old together, their hair turning to silver, their hands gnarled with age, but still fitting perfectly together. Their love was a quiet, mighty thing, as enduring as the land itself. One warm summer evening, when Cole was well into his 80s, he sat on the porch with May, watching the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He was frail, his powerful body finally succumbing to the gentle ravages of time. He leaned his head against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. "It was a good life, wasn't it, sweetheart?" he whispered, his voice thin as parchment. She held his hand, her touch still bringing him the same profound comfort it had on the very first day. "It was the best life," she replied, her own voice thick with love and unshed tears. He closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his lips. He thought of the empty man he had been, a ghost haunting his own life. And he thought of the terrified woman in a tattered white dress who had saved him. His promise had been to protect her, but the truth was, she had been the one to protect him. From the silence, from the sorrow, from the emptiness. His last breath was a quiet sigh of contentment, a peaceful release. May sat with him long after the sun had disappeared, holding his hand as the stars emerged one by one in the vast, dark sky. She had lost her husband, but she had not been left a ghost. She was a matriarch, a survivor, a woman deeply loved. The legacy of their promise was etched into the very soul of the land, a love story that would be whispered on the wind for generations to come.